Good evening, and welcome to the last Clergy Roundtable of the winter season. Before we begin the Lenten season, as we have studied the book, The World is About to Turn, Mending a Nation's Broken Faith by Rouse and Paul Ingram, with a foreword by Peter Marty. My name is Dawson Taylor. I have the great privilege of serving as senior minister here at Naples United Church of Christ in beautiful Naples, Florida. And I'm joined tonight by colleagues and friends, Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris-Ewing, who serves as assistant minister, and Reverend Dr. Who are you? Deborah Cross, who serves as minister for congregational care, at least for, let's see, a few more months. Have you started a countdown clock?
Well, not that I would admit.
Not that you're going to admit publicly. Exactly. No, we are grateful to be together this evening. And as I mentioned, this is the book that we started in January and have taking through this season, and then we will start a new book next week for the season of Lent. And I will say, I think I can speak for the team, that Sharon brought this book to us as an idea, and I'll speak for myself, but I think it speaks for the team. Little did I know how perfect it would be for this season, for this time that we've been through as a nation. So thank you for that gift.
Thank you all.
And we also want to say thanks to our production team of Brad and Alex are with us today. And so we want to thank them for making us look so good. And I appreciate that weight loss filter you put on. So thank you. And Wendy Guyette, our executive assistant, who always keeps things running smoothly as well. We are grateful to her also. So we are approaching as we said, it's the last week, but it's the 7th chapter. And then we're also going to take a look at the epilogue, because it actually has, I think, some really helpful things. In some ways, to be perfectly honest, I kind of like the epilogue a little better because it also starts off with John Lewis. So, anything that mentions John Lewis, I'm gonna really like. But the 7th chapter is entitled Building Bridges of Hope, 10 Ways Forward. So I want to say at the outset, yes, this is a list-heavy chapter, but have no fear. Our fantastic production team has the list, and they will make sure that we are ready to go to be able to show you those lists and as we go through them. But I do want to start, before we even jump on or into the lists. The statement is made in the chapter: the world cannot abide those who both condemn evil and envision a better future. How is this either true or untrue for you? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Thoughts, feelings, doubts, fears?
I could start.
Go.
I think that it's very difficult to do both and be heard. I think people tend to pick one side or the other. And I really noticed that, is that there are people who can condemn evil with either a righteous indignation or sometimes a pretty strident posture, and they're prophetic in their word. And then there are those who tend to see this positive way forward and can be almost hopelessly optimistic, and I tend to probably be on that side. But I think that we have a difficult time acknowledging evil, because, especially in ourselves, because we take it as personal criticism. And I think people have a really hard time with that. And so then we get stuck in, well, if it's that bad, how could there possibly be good that's going to come from it? So I think both sides are really very challenging for all of us.
Yeah. I was really struck by Deb, what you said about that you can't be in both camps and be heard. I was really struck by that kind of secondary comment, and I'm sure it's intentional on your part, but that really struck with me, because I do think you can perhaps have a place in both camps, so to speak, but can you really be heard in both camps? I don't know. Sharon, I'm curious.
Well, and I guess I wrestled with this because part of me thinks you have to do both. Because I just think of the examples of people who do nothing but criticize and point out how wrong things are, to whom people say, but then what are we supposed to do? How do we get out of this? And unless we can help those people who are trying to do it envision it, then we just get stuck with, well, it's, this is really bad. So I guess it may be hard to do both. Certainly, it's hard to do both simultaneously. Maybe it's even a cycle, but I think it's not very helpful unless we can team up with somebody who's the other for us. It's just not very helpful to be stuck in either side. And I think to be stuck on the side of just seeing a better future, sometimes, perhaps not always, but sometimes those people, I want to use the term Pollyanna, but they don't take seriously how evil or unjust something is. They're just, well, we can make it better without acknowledging the real hurt or the real pain or how awful it is for the people who are stuck in that. So that feels very generalized, but...
Well, I also think that it's really important to know that we tend to be on one side or the other. I don't think most of us do both sides well. I think, and that's where, I come back to, that whole sense of community, the body of Christ, is that we are all called to do different things, and it's recognizing each other's gifts and building on each other's gifts to create that perfect community or the beloved community or whatever it is that we're hoping to do. And not to minimize our own contribution to it. Because I think it's really easy for all of us to say, well, I can't do that. And then not recognize, but I can do that. And to recognize it takes all of us.
Yeah, there is a style of leadership, and really there's an entire methodology of thinking called paradoxical leadership that talks about the ability to hold two contrasting ideas in tension and still be able to manage them and function. And to me, that's what came to mind when I started thinking about this question and thinking and looking at this chapter, is there is to me this idea that you have to be able at some level to be able to hold these two ideas together and still function, not only as a pastor and a leader, but also, frankly, kind of in society today. But again, Deb, I think that's part of what struck me about when you responded is, but can you be heard? Or can you function? And what does that look like? And I don't know. And perhaps it changes some with what's happening in society or with where we find ourselves. Perhaps it's the give and take, that we experience. But to me, it's the paradox of it, that we have to find ways, both individually and collectively, to hold it in tension.
Listening to you made me think about the collective piece, and that the church is called to do both.
Right.
That we need to identify the places where we are straying far from what God intends, and offer that vision of what God's realm looks like. And so again, I love the body of Christ. Maybe different people in the community are doing different things, but the church certainly has to find a way to do both.
Right. We've talked about this during this particular Clergy Roundtable series, but I talked about it before, and we talked about it as a team, that I believe that the church is the last place in our nation where people who have very differing views can be together in one place and express those views and still be respected and heard. But that we have to work really hard to hold that tension together, because it is paradoxical and it is tension in in of itself.
I'm reminded of that whole thing about how often we say yes, but. Yes, I see that, but I can't do anything about it. And I think the church is called to be the yes and people. Yes, I see that, and we can do something. And so, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of, just in general staff management, how I often ask our staff colleagues that if you're going to bring a problem to me, my number one request is be prepared to offer some solution. It may not be the one we settle on, it may not be the one we go with, but it drives me crazy to just be told what's wrong and not have some solution, offered. Or people, like you were saying, people who are never optimistic that it can be better, or who are just overly optimistic that it'll never be a problem. And again, I think perhaps that's where it is if it's on the extremes, that's never helpful, either. No, I appreciate that. And as we begin looking at this list of 10 ways forward that the authors suggest, as we go through them, I'm asking you to look at each of these as we discuss them, and also be thinking through the lens of if there are any of these that you would take off the list, if there are any of these, or if you feel like this list is lacking something that you would want to add on. And then I'm also going to ask you, when we get through the list, what's your favorite, what's your least favorite? Because I'm going to be kind of curious, because I don't believe that they're necessarily ranked by the authors, but clearly they have an order here. So way one is recognize and repent of one's offenses. Now here's where the authors get interesting and a slightly verbose. Within a 10 list series, they have 7 under the number 1. So what I did was I selected the one that for me was the most meaningful, or perhaps caught my attention. And again, if you're playing the home game and following along with us, this is on page 86. But I was struck by when we talk about recognizing and repenting of our offenses. Number 3 says we standardize the other. And that's not language that I was familiar with before reading this. And it says, we presume that we are all really the same and that any differences would be eliminated if we knew each other better. While the comment, we are all children of God, may be well intended, it can trivialize the unique differences of another person's culture or religion. And I thought to myself, wow, how often in the name of diversity, I believe, and in genuine desire for that communal plurality, we say, well, we're really just all the same. We all bleed red, or, we're all in this together. But, I do think there is an idea of standardizing the other. And I've never thought before of that being something that I need to recognize within myself and frankly repent of. And so I'm naming that as something that I need to work on moving forward. So again, I certainly don't speak for you all, but that stood out to me. I didn't know if that particular one stood out to you or if there were others. Again, they talk about demonizing the other, trivializing the other, standardizing the other, colonizing the other, discounting the other, generalizing the other, and romanticizing the other.
I want to pick up on the one that you mentioned, just to say what really popped into my mind when you were talking about that is one of the ways, and this goes way back to discussions we had last summer about racism and being anti-racist, that one of the things that people will say trying to be anti-racist is, I don't see color,
Right.
I just see a human being. And if I'm a black person, I don't want to be told you don't see my color, because that's part of who I am.
Right.
It's part of how I experience the world. And I think that sense of, I'm trying to affirm you by saying we're the same, and I don't notice the ways that you're different, really is disrespectful.
Yeah.
And that just came to my mind.
Well, it's almost in our culture that we've almost been taught that different is bad, where that's not necessarily the case. It's when we other that difference, when we make that difference bad, is when the problem, to me, begins.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
The one that struck me was we generalize together. We take one person's specific behaviors and generalize it to the population. And that, I try really hard not to do that, but I think it's a real temptation for many of us. And, I think about, when I was younger, and this, I'll be honest with it, I remember I lived in Fresno, California, and I lived in a neighborhood that was pretty racially and ethnically diverse. And I was young, and I'd walk down the street, and there was a lot of comments made about me being a young woman by these young Hispanic men. And I remember thinking to myself, are all Hispanic men like that? I've learned not, but it was that one experience that made me think that I would generalize to others. And I had to challenge myself because I had to challenge myself not to take that next step. And I think that's an easy thing for us to do.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that insight. And that also reminds me of conversations that I've had, and actually, I'm not going to say a conflict, but a conversation that I had recently with a friend who was doing that. Was taking the experience of one or two individuals and multiplying it. And I didn't want to hear it.
It was not helpful to me. It was not helpful to the people I was encountering, but I didn't know what to do with it.
Sure.
And I hadn't had a lot of experience with it. And so I was 22 or whatever. But I was challenged by a friend who said, you can't do that.
Yeah.
You can't do that.
It's interesting. One of the things that comes to my mind is, and I haven't done it for each of these, but in response to this generalizing, we need, when we are conscious of these tendencies, to structure things so that it helps us not to do that. So, for example, I've long thought, if you're going to have a group of people, you should not have one woman among a whole bunch of men, or one black person among a whole bunch of white people, or one Muslim among a whole group of Christians, because it's almost inevitable that whatever they say, I'm going to generalize, oh, she speaks for women. And if you have at least two in the room, then you realize, oh, these two women don't agree. Not all women are the same. But we can, when we're intentional about how we do things and work together, we can set up situations that make it more or less likely that we will generalize or standardize or demonize or whatever, the more intentional we are.
You reminded me of my college days when I was like one of the third class of women at Notre Dame, and I was often the only woman in the class, and I know you had that same experience in seminary, and would often be asked, so what's the woman's point of view on that topic? I mean, seriously?
Yeah.
Really? So.
No, I understand that, and especially I often have that experience of being on panels where I think it's really important to help provide a gay perspective, and I'm always happy to do so. And I will often make the comment like, well, speaking for all gay men everywhere, this is what our experience is, or this is what we think about this. So yeah, I appreciate that. And the way to says, stand in solidarity with the oppressed. And I loved this. I was not familiar with this from the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA. It says that part of their ordination vows are, every ordained minister shall speak publicly to the world in solidarity with the poor and oppressed, calling for justice and proclaiming God's love for the world. Although I will say there are similar vows in our ordination ritual and liturgy, because I remember when preparing for Wesley Snedeker's ordination in July of 19. I remember thinking, this is a good exercise to be reminded of these vows. And then the authors go on to tell a really remarkable story about solidarity with the Jewish people of Sweden. But I'm not going to retell their story, but I do want to, because this book is so recently written, I do want to point this out on page 87. It says, attacks on Jews have doubled in the United States from 2017 to 2018 and have continued to increase, with the New York Times observing in an April 2019 editorial that violence against Jews had surged from the internet onto the streets. The reason I want to point that out is I consider myself fairly enlightened on issues such as this and have a close relationship with one of the rabbis in our community, and I was completely unaware of this. And so, as someone who works hard to stand with the oppressed and to identify those groups, when reading this, I was embarrassed to discover that I had failed in some ways to recognize that in our own community. And so I kind of assume that if I haven't seen it, that others probably haven't either. But again, I think the authors do a tremendous job of portraying some hope as well.
After the Tree of Life, the
Right.
massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue, I had a conversation with a very dear friend who was Jewish. And I've since said to her that I will never forget this, that she said, this is the first time that I have felt afraid as a Jew in America. And January 6th, people were wearing Camp Auschwitz t-shirts.
Yes.
And other anti-Semitic messages on t-shirts and other things. It's frightening to me that, to go back to calling out evil, that evil is not being called out enough.
Right. And it reminds us that we still have tremendous, tremendous work to do. Way 3 talks about educate and work for peace. They talk about a great organization that I'm distantly familiar with called Peace Camp, but it actually made me think about an organization that our church is affiliated with. And Deb, I was thinking about the Board of Mission and Outreach, I think 2 years ago, gave a grant to, and I know
Hands for Peace.
that I've given to, and Hands of Peace. Catherine Bettis, a member of our church, is on their board, and many members of our church are involved in the organization, and I know are generous with it. But Hands of Peace, and if I misrepresent, please correct me, but takes out young people from the United States, from Israel, and from Palestine,
Yes.
and brings them together in the summertime and in each of those locations to work through nonviolent ways of working through their differences and for intercultural experiences so that they have a really good understanding of one another, with the idea being that perhaps the only way that we'll ever, if you will, wage peace in the Middle East is that young people have a different way of understanding. And so I was really struck by having been to if you will, a home salon about their work, and really getting to meet the founder and the CEO of that organization about what tremendous work not only does that take, but tremendous work that they are doing and that other organizations like Peace Camp are doing. But to me, when you talk about world peace, that is that's so overwhelming. But organizations like that make it seem, okay, we can break this up into bite-sized pieces.
And there are a lot of NGOs that
Yeah.
are working in Israel and Palestine, really working hard with the youth. And when Sarah was living in Jerusalem, she worked with a little organization, East Jerusalem, that was bringing people together. And there are a lot of organizations that are really committed to that and are hopeful that sometime, some generation in the future, will see it come to fruition.
Yeah. And I think we all pray for that day as well. Way 4 talks about assess your degree of prejudice or openness to others. And on page 89, there's an actual chart of the intercultural continuum. But I appreciated that they offer a definition of racism that was, Ibram Kendi, in his book that we studied during our clergy roundtable last summer, I mean, Dr. Kendi is so remarkable in his work, but he's also so academic in his work. I appreciated this definition, and because to me it was a little more accessible in many ways. It says, racism is a kind of prejudice that comes with power, where one group sees themselves as superior to another. And you mentioned January 6th, the siege of the Capitol, the attempted siege of the Capitol. And I think that's what we saw a lot of, was a dominant culture, or frankly, let me rephrase, not a dominant culture in some ways, trying to live out a different understanding of power and trying to grab that power. But you just saw these anti-Semitic and racist overtones happening while that was going on. And so I think that when we talk about assessing our degree of prejudice and openness to others, that's what we saw in part playing out there.
One of the things that I was very struck by in this part of the chapter was describing racism as like an iceberg.
Oh, right.
I thought
That's
that
on the
was
next page.
so powerful because
No, you're exactly right. I highlighted that as well.
What you see on the outside is what got exhibited on January 6th. But
it's nowhere near.
It's been submerged for a really long time, and it's deep and it is pervasive. And I don't want to fearmonger either. It's there. It's just whether it's going to take over the dominant culture. All of us hope it will never do that. But I do think that image of iceberg is really important for us to remember, because even if it gets nipped in the bud right now, externally, it doesn't mean it's not gone. It's gone. It means it's just submerged for a while again, and we have to be vigilant.
I'm really, really grateful that you raised that, Deb, because I had not turned the page, but you're exactly right. And I think, and this just came to me, I think this is tied to a lot of what I've read, and I don't know that we've talked about this as a team, but that I've read about people saying, this is not who we are, and people saying, no, this is exactly who we are. And I will be honest that I don't know where I come out yet on that. I think I have a lot of reflection to do, because I think there is, as we talked earlier in the chapter, I think there is a little bit of the optimism yet.
Could be both and.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
talking,
No, I think that's a good point.
Both
Yeah.
and.
Right.
It is who we are, and it's not who we are.
Wow.
Or it's not who we want to be.
You're like such a great therapist, Deb. You should think about doing that. No, you're exactly right. There is, and as my therapists have said over time, both things can be true, right? You can have multiple truths happening at one time, because I think it is that paradoxical. That's really helpful. Pardon me while I have an epiphanal moment here, but that's exactly, I think you raised such an important point.
Well, and I would agree, and I think the other thing, and we've had this conversation, but the other thing that Kendi talks about is it's not just a belief, it's the effect of things. So I can say, the tip of the iceberg may say, I affirm all people and I welcome all people, and I'm not racist. But if my actions create power for me and lack of power for other people, if my actions create unequal conditions, then I can say I'm not racist all I want, but I am by virtue of what I've done. And I think it is a fascinating discussion, and I've read some of the same articles you have probably. And I guess it's kind of like Christians confessing their sin and repenting and realizing that in order to change, I have to acknowledge what I was doing that was hurtful or was against God's will in the beginning. And I think for the country to say, well, that's not who we are, keeps us from repenting of what has been true and being able to turn that around, because we don't have to turn it around if it's not who we are. But if it's part of our history, if it's part of what has been, then we have to acknowledge it, sometimes make amends, and figure out how to live differently.
I appreciate that, because part of, I think, where I have struggled some is I'm not really sure that as a white male of privilege, anyone really cares whether I think it's who we are or that it's currently who we are or where we're going, in the sense of that it is the iceberg. But I do think it is part of my responsibility to claim my part of it. So I do appreciate that. We're halfway through this list, I promise. Way 5, engage in storytelling with those different from yourself. The second paragraph starts by saying faith communities can give people a voice to share their stories by providing a safe place and setting guidelines for sharing and truth-telling, such as the following. And I'll go through that list. It says, take responsibility. It's not no, it is an acronym. Take responsibility, practice empathetic listening, be sensitive to differences in communication styles and feelings, ponder what we hear and feel before we speak, challenging for extroverts, examine our own assumptions and perceptions, keep confidentiality for the sake of healthy community, tolerate a right or wrong. We can agree to disagree. We can talk about agree or disagree later. But here's what I want to say about this is I have some dear friends that you all have heard me talk about. And actually, well, Sharon, you weren't living here yet, but Deb, you had the chance. Actually, you did not have the chance to meet, because that was my associate installation. But I have dear friends who have begun a church in Chicago, Illinois, Gilead, and it is United Church of Christ. It's duly yoked with the Disciples of Christ and United Church of Christ. And that church is based in part on storytelling, because there is such power in people owning and telling their stories. And I remember when Vince and Rebecca were telling me about, this initial idea, I remember thinking how cool it sounded, but remember thinking like, well, there's a lot of vulnerability there. I mean, are people really going to just tell their stories? But I think there really is something, 3-4 years later, they're really doing some amazing stuff and still going very strong. And so I'm struck by that power of storytelling. And I'm imagining that you've seen that really at work in some cool ways.
I was just thinking about how, do you listen to StoryCorps at all?
Oh, yeah. I love it.
On NPR, they tell stories, and there's always one point to them, but it's one particular person's story. And I can't tell you how many of them I've remembered because they were story and not preaching.
Yeah.
One in particular, I didn't understand how powerful it was to grieve with someone else until somebody told the story of her father telling her to always go to the funeral. Mm-hmm. And when her father died and people came to the funeral, she understood the power of grieving with a community. And so that's just one example, but I find that when I can enter somebody else's life story with empathy, it changes me. It really does. And
this is something we've talked around, I think, throughout this series, as we're talking about relating to people who are different from us, that one of the challenges is always, if I don't know any Muslims, if I don't know personally any Haitians, I can have all of the right beliefs about that they're children of God just like me and no better, no worse, but I don't know them. And that it's when we can interact and have those conversations. Last 2019, when we had Thanksgiving and we invited members of the mosque to come, it was wonderful conversation around the table that was just so important, because we can't relate with empathy and love and caring to people we just don't know at all.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually a great, just this, it's on page 91. It's just this one sentence right below that list. Stories carry meaning and communicate values. And I just think that that's so important. The sixth is participate in interfaith conversation. And Sharon, you just came to mind as I was reading this part. It talks about table fellowship, where people, and actually the Thanksgiving came to my mind. I wrote that off to the side here, where people, the model that they talk about, which is a common model that I've heard about, I've never participated in, where people of different faiths or different backgrounds of some kind come together around a common meal. And really just, again, almost referencing the previous one, share stories, share life, they break bread. And I think there's such power in that. And then they suggest some ground rules, which also made me hearken back to the week where we talked about the rules that you use when you teach a class, and how important those are to help create safety for people. And I think that people really appreciate that.
Do you remember that book, The Faith Club?
Oh, yeah.
Did you ever read that? I would really recommend it to people, because it was after 9/11, and 3 women in New York City got together, one Christian, one Jew, and one Muslim, and to try to talk with each other, to understand the differences, so that they could teach their children. So if you haven't read it, it's a worthwhile read to go back, because it was an intentional connection on a weekly basis for these women to connect so that they could change how they taught their children.
Yeah.
It was great.
The Faith Club. Yeah,
I think it was the Faith Club, right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
There's actually an organization now called
Yeah.
Daughters of Abraham.
Yes.
That has chapters across the country, but very strict rules about there have to be an equal number of women from Jewish, Christian, and Muslim faiths, so that one isn't dominating. And they have rules for that. But I think those kinds of conversations are critical. I was reminded, and I guess it's one of these, it mentions confidentiality.
Yeah.
But when you talked about your rules for your classes, and I know you and I've taught classes together, I think when we are vulnerable and when we share stories, that's where that confidentiality can be so important, because my story is mine to share. And it doesn't mean that when I've told you, I want you to go tell everybody else, because that's no longer in a relationship. And so it's really complicated. I won't go on, but it is.
No, it does. And it's actually one of the things that I respect and love the most about our caregiver support group is I don't know a thing about what happens in there. Meaning that I have great trust about the work that happens in there, and I know that there is life-transforming support and work that happens there, and I know that they share deep things, but I mean, never, and I'm personally close to one of the kind of early founders. She wasn't the founder, but has helped support it. And she and I have dinner from time to time, and I've never been told what happens. And I think that's really special.
Yeah, it is.
And in part, they have great leadership that always make sure that the things that the clergy team need to know so that we can respond, we know. But I think that is, and it does get complicated. Way 7 talks about get to know your community. And the thing I appreciate about this section is they have some very specific how-tos on this. They talk about interviewing community leaders. They talk about the YMCA as a possibility or a civic leader. I wrote off to the side on this chapter, or on this section, about, I always make this comment about wherever, if I were to blindfold you and parachute you into Collier County, you could land in the middle of Port Royal, Pelican Bay, or frankly, our three neighborhoods, and you would think you've landed in one of the most beautiful paradise place, of wealth and privilege, which you would have. Or you could land in Immokalee or certain parts of the county and think that you've landed in almost abject poverty, which you would have. And yet, we are all neighbors, we are all part of the same community. And I think it's easy sometimes, or I'll say it this way, I think it can be challenging sometimes to remember the two worlds that exist in a place like this with such beauty. And, again, I've had such enlightening conversations in my years of living here with people like Lisa Lefko at Habitat, Linda Oberhaus at the Shelter for Abused Women and Children. I think it is so vital that we know our community and know, frankly, the good, the bad, the pretty, the ugly, the places that need us to stand with them. I don't need to preach, but I'm just...
And I'm going to complicate it again by saying, unfortunately, we dichotomize the rich and the poor so that we don't even realize the people who are living in the zip codes that you would think are quite well-to-do, who are not well-to-do, or who are alone and lonely. I remember several years ago being part of a program where we learned a lot about the community, but one of the things was how many lonely seniors there are, and how there's very little, I think there's one subsidized housing for seniors in the greater Naples area. So I think some of the needs that we need to know about are among us but hidden. But we need to know all of it, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, it needs to be the full story, for sure. Well, and then again, the authors write at the very end of that section, and then we need to act on what we've learned, which, there is that part that's so important. Way 8, embrace diversity and reject nationalism, which of course hearkened me back to our conversation, our very rich conversation on nationalism and patriotism. It talks about, right here on page 94, nationalism stands as perhaps the greatest threat facing our nation and our world today, for it assumes, especially in the case of the United States, that we are somehow superior to the rest of the world, or that we can selfishly focus on ourselves and our own needs without regard to the plight of the rest of human life on this planet. And then it has this great speech from a show that I love called Madam Secretary, which again, if you are still social distancing and you feel like I have, that you have absolutely watched everything on Netflix but haven't watched Madam Secretary, I highly commend it.
Okay, I have to just, that whole speech is one of the best things in this book. And I'm just going to throw out one line which I thought was great, and it's, patriotism, on the other hand, is about building each other up and embracing our diversity as the source of our nation's strength, which I thought was just like...
Yeah, when I was reading it, I thought, I've got to go back and rewatch that episode.
I kind of wanted to.
I know, exactly. And then again on page 95, it talks about Christian nationalism, which again, I think, and in Sharon's words, complicates it, but I think is an important part of that as well. Way 9, I'm just going to be honest, was a little bit more difficult for me to wrap my mind around, but I think it's also because it's a privilege of Americans that we don't have to worry about, and that is understand the path of hate that leads to genocide. And they define genocide as the intentional effort to destroy a group of people in whole or in part. But I will say, as someone, again, who loves political science, Bill Clinton talks about that one of the greatest regrets that he has from his presidency is not addressing the genocide in,
Rwanda?
I
Was it
think it was
Rwanda?
Rwanda sooner. That he feels that he did not, that he let that go too long. And so again, I think it's coming from an absolute place of privilege that I can say that this one doesn't, that I
Right.
struggled with it.
But it was very helpful on page 96 to see the progression of hate.
Yes.
And you can ignore it at any level, but it just keeps getting worse and worse. It goes from hate, or it goes from stereotypes about other people to prejudice against other people to, legal discrimination against other people, which then leads to violence against other people, and finally to genocide because they are less than human. And yeah.
Well, and again, not to tie everything to it, but again, I just can't help but harken back to January 6th and think about, in my opinion, where we are on this progression. We're way past stereotypes, we're way past prejudice, we're way past discrimination, and we were at violence, which is only one step above genocide.
And they do mention specifically white supremacy.
Yes.
And in terms of our discussions about racism and about othering, how we other people. And I think I just finished listening to Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste.
Yes.
And the hierarchy that we create and simplified statement about white supremacy that says we whites should be at the top and anybody else should be below, that's very scary stuff. And I think we have to call that out in every way that we can. And this just is kind of the worst case scenario of where that can lead if it's not called out.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And number 10, never stop loving. But I got to tell you, so I thought, okay, this is my kind of language. I'm good here. But then the first sentence just convicts me. How did a nation of immigrants come to hate immigrants, to fear and despise those who are different? And, again, I thought that I couldn't remember which week it was, but when I just thought about when we began to name some of the issues at work in our nation, and I thought about immigration because I think a lot of it has to do with our immigration policies and having trouble with those. And then I really liked on page 98, they reference an attorney who wrote an editorial in Lexington, Kentucky. So here's my call out to Roberta Buckley, who says, we must change our approach to the issues now dividing us. We must stop digging in our heels for our position without a care for the other side. Instead, we should see these issues as opportunities to build unity. We must be eager to learn the other's viewpoint, empathize, and work for win-win compromises. Above all, we must strive for civility and treat others as we want to be treated. So there is the golden rule. There is unity, civility, so many of the things that, frankly, at the season that we're living in our nation's history, it feels that we're lacking, is what I felt as I read that. So as you look at this list, first of all, is there one that you would take off?
No.
I mean, that was my thing, was I thought it was a fair question to ask, but I couldn't come up with one. Is there one you would add, or you think, is there something missing?
I don't know if it's missing, but I think it's really important because I think it's the temptation for all of us on both sides is to resist contempt for the other person. And that kind of is underneath, I think, the prejudice one.
Yeah.
But I think it's that important to call out because it doesn't seem to matter whether you're on the left or the right. There is just this contempt for the other person that is just poisonous in our culture.
So that's interesting because I was going to say there's no word about grace. And I don't know if you would, if we were in a legislative body, if you would take that as a friendly amendment. But
Tell me more about that.
I feel like we need to learn when we fail in these areas that we need to learn to be gentle with ourselves, but also gentle with the other.
Absolutely.
Because, and this is more confessional probably than anything else, I can get so dug in and I can get so convicted that I'm right that sometimes it's hard to be grace-filled and graceful in some of those arguments.
Yeah.
Like, it's very difficult for me to be graceful about or toward people who created the situation on the 6th at the Capitol.
I think for me, the way I might describe it is I want to resist contempt in order to understand.
Yeah.
Because when I'm in contempt, I refuse to see anything that would have led to that. And I, as we've all looked at how this could have happened, we've read lots of different things, and it's really interesting to see what has led people down the path. And that is feeling like they don't have a part of the American dream. They feel marginalized. They feel otherized. They feel so many different things. It doesn't mean it justifies the behavior.
Right.
It doesn't mean I can't disagree with it, but I do need to understand.
Right, and I think that's where we have to find a way to describe what the aim is that it doesn't mean that you endorse or allow the behavior, but it does mean that you allow the relationship to, so that you can then try to engage in a way that allows you to learn.
One of I'm in some colleague groups on Facebook, and a clergy colleague sat down for coffee over with someone from her congregation who had gone to Washington for the Stop the Steal, and listened and sat there. I couldn't have done what she did when she described it, but she was intentional. She says, my job as a clergy person is not to convince, it's not to change, it's to enter into the suffering of another person. And I was like, oh my gosh.
Wow.
What a powerful statement. I don't know if I agree with it completely,
Right.
but it's a starting point.
Right. I'm not sure I do either, but I agree with your assessment as well.
I had a couple of different things that I was going to add, but this just made me think of another one. I was interested in the fact that one of the ways is to educate and work for peace, when throughout the book, the focus is on justice. So I kept saying peace and justice.
Interesting.
I mean, the whole book is focused on
that.
Justice.
Right, you're so right. I just didn't catch that, yeah.
The other thing, which is really a theme in the book, which is maybe implicit in these, but I would call out separately, is to maintain, and it relates to not having contempt, but to maintain humility in relationship to others. That whole concept of intellectual humility, spiritual humility, racial humility, cultural humility. I think when we're listening to those stories, we have to be listening with humility, that we're not listening to look for what's wrong with what they're saying, or to fix them, or to decide that, yeah, we were right, we're better in some way. I think humility is really important. When you just start talking about January 6th, and that date is going to live on. One of the things that's not here, but I keep struggling with, is teaching people to think critically. Because one of the reasons we got where we are is so many people believed things that simply were not true. And if we cannot learn to make some distinction between what's true and what's not where it's a difference of opinion, but where we know the earth is round, it's not flat. And where there are those, because it's hard for me to figure out how to engage with people when we don't start with the same basic understanding of the facts. That's the challenge for me. So I'd add think critically, and you also ask what's most important. I would say way 10, never stop loving, because if you want to, I could make it include everything else.
Yeah. What do you think is most important?
They're all important, but I think for me, at this moment in time, the thing that I need to learn the most is engage in the storytelling.
Yeah.
With those, and I've just become really aware. We're in the middle of looking at real estate with our daughter, and I just realized how much our housing dictates who we're in contact with. And, she's choosing to live in a really multicultural, multiracial community, and how it's hard to engage in storytelling if we have no contact.
Right.
So.
No, I appreciate that. Well, I want to move us to the epilogue because, like I said, I appreciate it for lots of reasons. The first being that it starts with a quote from John Lewis that he wrote before his death that was published as an essay in the New York Times. And this is just a very brief excerpt, but it says, "Democracy is not a state, it is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble," which was a theme throughout Congressman Lewis's life. What, in your opinion, is the greatest challenge facing our nation right now?
I think there's two.
Okay.
If you indulge me on two.
Of course.
One we've talked about a lot, and that is nationalism. I think is a huge challenge because it includes so many other things. But I think what is driving that is the great disparity between rich and poor. Is that the disparity is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I think it contributes to the narrative of people who are pushing nationalism and against globalism and against everything they perceive as against their ability to get ahead, and I think that's at the heart of a lot of it.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
I guess I would come at a similar issue, but from a slightly different angle, just to say the polarization that we've reached, that people are so divided and the chasm seems so great that engaging in storytelling with people who are different feels far off. It feels like a worthy goal, but how do we even move toward that? And yet it feels essential, both for the soul of our country and who we are, and I agree with what you've said different times, Dawson, about the church should be a place where people who disagree can come together. That's critically important. But if we can't, then we can't work together. And the problems that we're facing are so great, we can't solve them or even make progress if we can't work together. And I absolutely agree about the income inequality, which is has just grown, as you've said. I think there's the elephant in the room is the pandemic, and that I feel frustrated, as so many people do, with the rollout of vaccines. And part of me just is like, we knew this was coming. We knew there would be a vaccine. Why wasn't somebody making a plan? But until we can deal with that and recover some physical health among us, it's going to be hard to do, again, to come together to do other things. I mean, as a nation, we need to grieve the hundreds of thousands of lives that have been lost, not to mention the people who will live with lifelong challenges because of that. And obviously related to that is the economy, and that relates to the inequality. But until people have what they need to live, the basic necessities of shelter and food and dignity, we will not be the America that we say we are and want to be.
Right. My answer, and this might sound trite, it's not intended to be, is division. Because for me, that was an all-encompassing to a lot of what you both have said. Because to me, it is a division around who gets the vaccine and how they get it and when they receive it. It's about income inequity. It's about just who's in, who's out, who's right, who's wrong. Because we seem really, really eager to point that out to one another. And I just feel like so much of that drives us. So then my subsequent or my follow-up question is, how do we as the church, how do we address said problems? Because I don't want to end not only this evening, but our series on the note of what's wrong. It's kind of like what I was saying earlier when I asked one of our staff to please don't bring me a problem and not have some sense of a solution. So where's the church's role? What is our responsibility? Or what can we do to help address some of those?
I'm going to defer.
Well, I think one of the first things that may seem trite or simplistic, but is that we have to acknowledge that we have a role in responding to this. Because there's it would be really comfortable to just get inside the sanctuary and have wonderful worship and wonderful music and feel really good and not engage with that world outside. And so I think the first thing is to say, we are called to live in this world and make a difference. And when we pray, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that we're committing to trying to make a difference.
Oh.
So that's the symbol. Then you can do the next steps.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I do think there is something about, I do think it honestly starts with prayer and humility. And I do think there is something about bringing people together in a common place. To say you've got to start with relationships and with common ground. Because if you don't have common ground, or, it's, call it storytelling, call it common ground, call it beginning with love, starting with grace, it's got to start somewhere, right? And again, that's my belief about part of what the church can and should do and should be doing.
And I think it's also acknowledging that it is our role to engage with the culture. I know there are people in the church who would much rather we stay completely out of that and just enjoy the experience of being in the sanctuary, connecting with God. Don't get me wrong. It's what keeps me sane, is that grounding in faith and spirituality. But if that's all we do, then we're not the force that Jesus thought we could be in this world for good. We can't be the light of the world. We can't be the salt of the earth unless we acknowledge, yes, this is what we are called to do and be. And as difficult as it is, and as difficult as it is have hope in this culture, I still think we're called to be that and to do that.
And we have a message that is one of hope,
Yeah.
and a message that speaks against the kinds of divisions and polarizations that we're talking about, because it's a message that says every single person is created by God, that God loves every single one of us, and that God wants us to live together in a just and compassionate community. So that's a message to say the way things are going, that's not the way God wants it.
Yeah.
And we have something else to offer.
And if we can be the beloved community, it's the only place in our culture that gets a chance to be it. Not just Christians, but every beloved community of faith can model something different. And people long to see something beyond what they're seeing on the news. And if we can be that, it's amazing.
So dare we say that the church still has relevance?
We dare.
I was going to say, I mean, to me, that's the thing that keeps resonating in my mind is, the final word being that the church is very much relevant and very much has a place in our culture, and perhaps in many ways is the saving grace, or can be the saving grace of what we see today happening in the culture around us. And I do want to conclude with these words that David Brooks wrote in the New York Times that the authors mention, because I do think that Mr. Brooks is not always the most optimistic person that God put on the face of the earth, but I do appreciate his, I believe, optimistic words here. He wrote this: "The pandemic has been a massive humanizing force, allowing us to see each other on a level much deeper than politics, see the fragility, the fear, and the courage. We're also being united by those who are sacrificing for the common good. Americans have responded to this crisis with much more generosity and solidarity than we had any right to expect. The job ahead is to make this unity last." Now, I will admit, as I did in our notes for this evening, that he wrote this before the storming of the Capitol, and that I struggle to see some of the unity that he speaks of, but that I will cling fast to this hope and to this unity, and that I know that together we will work to try to bring this unity together and to see it to fruition in the future. So again, we appreciate you spending either a Wednesday evening or whenever you pull this from an archive, either on YouTube or live stream or the Naples United Church of Christ website. It's been a wonderful discussion throughout these winter weeks. And we look forward to getting started next week for our Lenten study on Ash Wednesday. And we hope that you will continue this journey with us. So once again, thank you for being with us.